Hello, Michaela. Hopefully, this might be the last video anticipating your arrival back to school on Monday, though I do understand it will be on a limited basis between now and Christmas. That'll still be very refreshing. And in fact, in that sense, we'll even see how things go with the school in general. We've had quite a few absences all the way from elementary through high school since coming back from Thanksgiving break. So, anyway, so I hope you're in health and your family is as well. This will also be a shorter video because this week we didn't work through the packet as much. We had a class discussion that kind of got onto an application side subject. And then today, Cassie had to leave for a funeral, and Olivia and really the high school had started doing a kind of a project in reorganizing Mr. Hudeman's room. So since I was down to 2 students, I let her keep working in Mr. Hudeman's room, so we really didn't have class today. So fairly short to get you caught up, and you're caught up in economics if you've done the that activity worksheet that I gave you using the investment calculator. You'll be good to go with that. And so in our hermeneutics notes, we are on page 26, toward the bottom where it says the 10 Commandments. And so we're going to look at that. How does that relate to what God reveals about his name and what that means in application to us? You know, because certainly the 10 Commandments are the heart of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. This was the even though there certainly is a lot of other rules, laws in the Torah. This is a summary of them, and in one sense, I was sharing with the other girls too that in my mind, one way to picture the Old Covenant transition into the New Covenant is to have a picture of growing up from birth to childhood through teenage years to adult years to elderly years in growing in wisdom, growing in stature. And so that leads into this first point here about when you first hear the word commandment, what other kinds of words does that bring to mind? If I asked quick, give me 3 words that you think of when you hear the word commandment. A lot of people would say the word rules, which is your first blank. We do tend to think of commandments as a set of rules, or we sometimes tend to think of them as a list of do's and don'ts. Do love God, don't commit murder. And in fact, it seems like there's a whole lot of don'ts in that short list of the 10 Commandments, and so it sometimes can seem a little bit more impersonal as well, because it's a list. And in the New Covenant, Jesus brings that further into application in life with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And so in that same kind of analogy of going through growth, when you instruct in a series of do's and don'ts and shorter rules, easier to remember, administer, discipline, that's how you train a child. If McGizzy does something wrong, I'm not going to call him over and say, McGizzy, let's get into a philosophical discussion of the nature of good and evil and right and wrong. I'm going to say, no, McGizzy, you do not do that. That is wrong. What's the right thing to do? And let's work on that. And so I like to think of the 10 Commandments as that kind of stage of where God's people were in preparing them for ultimately the coming of the Messiah, when the church, as it's always been our goal, can reach maturity. In fact, if you read like in Ephesians 4 and other places, that's our call, to reach maturity. And we do that with more of that kind of conversation and heart-to-heart transparency and getting deeper into the whys and the undergirdings of things rather than, having church with a list of do's and don'ts. So when you turn the page in your handout, that's why I say this, that the 10 Commandments are fundamentally positive and intimate if you view it in that perspective of moving someone toward maturity. And I think that's exhibited as a goal in the Hebrew word for commandment, which an alternative meaning or definition for commandment in Hebrew could also be translated as living word. So that's your first blank on the top of page 27. And so if you were to kind of compare your first impressions of what do you think when you hear 10 commandments versus what do you think of when you would hear 10 living words, I think there'd be a little bit of a different way that you'd perceive those. A living word is something spoken by God meant to be applied to life that does not only imply, require relationship. And so these are living words. These 10 living words are meant to bring life. Life is found in these instructions. And then consider this too for your next couple blanks. If you look at it in the light of being living words, the thou shalt nots are secondary admonitions. So secondary is your next blank. They are secondary admonitions to the first several commandments, because the verse right before where all the thou shalt nots start with that list that we're familiar with, talks about that God will show favor to those who love and keep his commandments. And so it all is predicated on loving God and serving him and doing his will. And you can only do that by knowing him. And if you want an idea too of what I mean by the thou shalt nots are secondary to the primary of loving God and serving him, is that if you are loving God and serving him, God will provide you with everything you need. Now, sometimes in life, we get angry with or upset with God because he doesn't provide all we want, but he does provide all that we need. And so, for example, if we are loving God and serving God, we won't find ourselves in a position of having to commit murder to get something that we need, or to seek out an affair outside of marriage and commit adultery if the husband and the wife are walking in the love of God and love towards each other in that way. We don't bear false witness about our neighbor or steal for something that we need if God is our provider in relationship with him. And so the thou shalt nots don't even come into play if you're loving and serving God, which is always a good way to approach things in any kind of, addiction, habit, something that you're trying to break in your life, is that, rather than focus on what you should not be doing, the better focus is on what you should be doing, because if you do the shoulds, the habits don't come into play. So the first case is trying to avoid temptation, and the second is to walk in something positive, something life affirming. And so your next couple blanks here at the bottom of the handout is that when God has given you all you need, so need is your next blank. No destructive behavior is tempting to those who are being blessed by God. Life is meant to be good, and that's your next blank. So with that kind of background into the 10 commandments or the 10 living words, we're going to focus on just one of those that focuses on the name of God, since that's been what we've been studying a lot. And that is Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. I've got it written out for you. It says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." So vain is your next blank. And the rest of the verse then says, "For the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." So obviously this issue concerns, and this is your next blank, concerns the name of God. We are not to take his name in vain. What does that mean? And that's what we're going to explore, because what's the typical response if you asked anybody, what does it mean to take the Lord's name in vain? What do you think the most common answer is? At least I can tell you from my experience that the most common interpretation people would give about what does it mean to take the Lord's name in vain is don't use God's name as a curse word or a swear word. Don't say GD or, that kind of a thing. That is not what this commandment is talking about, and that's what we're going to demonstrate. And that's a few of your next blanks. So, at the bottom of page 27, it says, if you're like me, you've probably heard that this is a command not to use God's name as a curse or a swear word. That is really common. In fact, when I asked the girls that same question, that was their response too. Mostly they've heard it being talked about in that kind of a context. Don't use God's name as a swear word. But is this what it really means? There is a lot of evidence to not only just think it's not, but to know it's not. For example, this is the third commandment given, and so this is third is your next blank. And as I said before, it follows a verse previous to it about loving and serving God only. And a lot of ancient literature, when it comes to lists, put the most important things at the top of the list, and then kind of filter down and through the degrees of importance. And so would not using God's name as a swear word, rank higher in sin than committing murder or adultery or stealing or bearing false witness? I don't think there'd be many people who would say yes to that. So, just even its placement tells you that there's something more to this commandment and what it means. And in fact, to finish out the bottom of page 27, the Jewish people never had a problem using God's name as a curse word. We have no evidence in history or archaeology about that. In fact, it was just the opposite. They often struggled with using his name at all. So all is your second to last blank on the bottom of page 27. Because refusing to be good hermeneutes, as we've seen, has always been at issue. Remember when Moses came down from the mountain with the commandments? He offered them, God wants you to be hermeneutes too. And what was their response? No, we're afraid, Moses. You speak with God. You have relationship with him. You be a good hermeneute, but we will not. And so that fear led to unbelief, and that unbelief meant no relationship with God. And so they weren't intimate with his name. And so if we flip over to page 28 then, we're actually almost done for how far we've gotten in class. To give you an example of how the Jews struggled to use God's name at all, it even got to the point where the name of God was only spoken once a year. If you can imagine that. And it was spoken by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. So your first blank at the top of page 28 is year, and your second blank is atonement. The Day of Atonement was the holiest day of the year. This is when blood sacrifices were made for the sins of individuals and the entire nation. It is the precursor, forerunner of the sacrifice Jesus would make by shedding his blood on the cross once and for all, never having to be repeated again like the sacrifices of bulls and rams and sheep and goats and that kind of a thing. So, on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year, the people would be gathered around the temple area, and the high priest would step out in front of the people, and he would loudly proclaim God's name, but there was a further stipulation. Other priests who were in charge of the worship aspect of the priesthood played music loudly enough to prevent anyone from hearing, which is your next blank, from hearing what the high priest had said. So God's name pronounced, spoken, declared once a year to blaring music so that people couldn't even, it was too loud, the music was. So Exodus 20 verse 7 can't mean don't use God's name in vain when they hardly used his name at all. And that's the issue that God is always trying to get back to his people too. Yes, I want you to use my name. I want you to be in relationship with me. And so furthermore, moving on in your notes, the command has a major warning to it. So warning is your next blank. Because remember the second part of Exodus 20 verse 7, after thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, says, For the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. And so sometimes I think if somebody commits murder, there's obvious punishment. There's an arrest and a trial and a conviction and a jail sentence or a death sentence. Do you see that happening to someone who uses God's name as a swear word? No, of course not. So I don't think using God's name as a curse or swear word carries with it the weight of what's this punishment, which sounds pretty serious, that surrounds taking or using God's name in vain. And so your final blank for today is, would a commandment solely against cursing or swearing bear the weight of this judgment? So judgment is your next blank. And so that's what we'll move on into in our next class is, what does this commandment really mean then? And we're going to dive into that. And I think it's a really cool study that way. So I will sign off for now. And again, look forward to hopefully seeing you on Monday. So eager to hear, what your process has been like, even if you're, and I'm really sensitive to if how much you want to share, how much you don't want to share. If anything that you might want to talk to me about privately, or what you might want to say to the class, or to anybody else, don't feel compelled or pressured, with any expectation that way. But we do want to do what would help you continue to move forward. So, do let me know what I can do to help you out in that process. So, continued prayer for you and blessings, and hope to see you soon. Signing off.